Rachel Jackson, a 40-year-old black woman with a calm but commanding presence, walks out of an important international meeting in the heart of Washington, D.C. She is no ordinary woman. Rachel is a highly respected cybersecurity expert, known for her work in protecting critical national infrastructure from international threats. This evening, she's finally stepping away from the intense discussions about international cybersecurity collaboration, where she presented a groundbreaking initiative aimed at preventing cyber attacks on government networks. Her mind is still buzzing with thoughts from the meeting, but she's focused on winding down and getting home to her husband, David Jackson. David, a seasoned CIA operative, has been her rock for many years. Together, they form a powerful team, one in the public eye as a brilliant mind in tech, and the other in the shadows, working on high-stakes covert operations. They share a deep bond and a unique understanding of each other's world, one built on trust, precision, and shared strategies. Both of them are highly trained and methodical, always prepared for worst-case scenarios. On her way home, Rachel stops by a small 24-hour convenience store in a quiet, upscale neighborhood to grab a few snacks and coffee for the road. She prefers doing this herself, without involving bodyguards or other security details, enjoying these small moments of normality. The store is dimly lit and nearly empty, with only the cashier and another customer milling around the aisles. It's peaceful, or so it seems. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Officer Kyle Roberts, a white police officer in his late 30s, is parked outside in his patrol car, idly watching the neighborhood. Roberts is a man with a history. He's been working in law enforcement for almost 15 years, but unlike other officers who rise through the ranks, Kyle's career has stalled. His past is littered with unresolved complaints of excessive force and racial profiling, complaints that were quietly dismissed due to his connections within the force. His personal life is equally troubled: a failed marriage, financial problems, and growing bitterness about how his career hasn't turned out as he envisioned. He's angry, and though he wouldn't admit it to himself, he harbors a deep-seated resentment toward people like Rachel, successful, self-assured, and, in his mind, undeserving of the success they've achieved. Tonight, Kyle's patrol is uneventful, too uneventful for his liking. His shift has dragged on without any action, and he's itching to assert control, to feel the rush of power he craves. As he sits in his squad car, sipping stale coffee, he notices Rachel step out of the store. There's something about her that irks him immediately. It's not just her race, though, that plays a part. It's the way she carries herself with a quiet confidence, how she seems so out of place in what he deems a nice neighborhood. In his mind, people like her don't belong here. She's too well dressed, too calm. His gut tells him there's something off about her, though he has no concrete reason to suspect anything, just a vague, gnawing bias that's been ingrained in him for years. Rachel, oblivious to the watchful eyes of the officer, walks to her car parked a short distance away. The night is still and quiet, the soft hum of streetlights the only sound. She's wearing a dark professional blazer and jeans, with her hair tied back, looking every bit the part of the high-powered professional she is. Her mind is still on the meeting, replaying the discussions about security protocols as she reaches for her car keys. That's when Kyle decides to act. With a flick of his wrist, he throws the patrol car into gear, pulling up next to her as she's about to open her car door. The sudden approach of the vehicle makes her pause. She's been trained by her husband to always stay alert, to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts are telling her that something is wrong. She feels the tension building in the air even before Kyle steps out of his car. Kyle says, his tone already dripping with authority, as if he's trying to impose control over the situation before it even begins. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Rachel looks up, a little surprised but keeping her composure. She's been in similar situations before, not exactly like this, but she knows how to handle herself. She's been taught how to deal with police encounters, especially as a black woman in America. Her calm demeanor doesn't falter as she responds, just picking up some snacks before heading home. Kyle narrows his eyes, not liking her composed response. She's too calm, too in control, and it bothers him. He's used to people reacting with fear or deference, not with the kind of quiet confidence Rachel displays. He glances at her car, a sleek, black vehicle that looks out of place in his mind, and it fuels his suspicions further. He doesn't have any real reason to stop her, but that doesn't matter to him right now. His gut is telling him that she's trouble. "Do you live around here?" Kyle presses, stepping closer, his hand resting casually near his belt where his holster is visible. He's not drawing his weapon, but he's making sure she sees it. Rachel, still calm, shakes her head slightly. "I live nearby, officer. Is there something wrong?" Kyle doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he sizes her up, trying to find anything that would justify escalating this interaction. He's looking for an excuse, even if he doesn't realize it consciously. His biases are working on autopilot. Finally, he speaks, his tone sharp. "I'll need to see some ID." Rachel hesitates for a moment, not because she's afraid, but because she understands exactly what's happening. She knows this isn't a routine stop, this is profiling. She's dealt with it before. Her first instinct is to comply, to de-escalate the situation. She doesn't want to cause a scene, especially not in this empty street at night. Slowly, she reaches for her bag, pulling out her wallet. "Here you go," she says, handing over her ID. Kyle snatches it from her hand without so much as a glance at her face, his eyes scanning the card with feigned concentration. He's already made up his mind that she doesn't belong here, and now he's just trying to find a way to justify what's becoming a blatant abuse of power. After a few seconds, he hands the ID back to her, but the tension doesn't leave his posture. "You mind popping the trunk for me?" he asks, more of a command than a question. "Just need to check a few things." Rachel's heart skips a beat, but she maintains her exterior calm. She knows she's done nothing wrong, but she also knows how quickly situations like this can spiral out of control. She's already mentally running through the advice David has given her: stay calm, don't escalate, control the narrative. But she also knows that there's a line, and she's getting dangerously close to it. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" she asks, her tone polite but firm. "I've given you my ID. I've done nothing wrong." Kyle's eyes harden. He doesn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like her. He steps closer, his presence now unmistakably threatening. "You heard me. Open the trunk. Now." Rachel knows she has to make a choice. Rachel feels the tension in the air thickening. She's been in high-pressure situations before, whether in international meetings or negotiating contracts, but this is different. Here, she isn't just defending a business decision, she's defending her dignity, her rights, and more crucially, her safety. Officer Kyle Roberts stands just inches away, his posture rigid, his authority oozing from every inch of his being. There's no one else on the street, no witnesses, and Rachel knows that things could take a darker turn very quickly if she doesn't tread carefully. She glances briefly at her car, and then back at the officer. The question of opening her trunk feels less about genuine suspicion and more like a test, a show of power. She knows that if she refuses, the situation could escalate in ways she doesn't want to imagine. But she also knows that she has nothing to hide and no legal obligation to comply with his arbitrary demand. Rachel makes a measured decision. She's calm, but the adrenaline is beginning to flow through her veins. Without breaking eye contact, she speaks again, her voice clear and steady, though firm enough to let him know she's not intimidated. "Officer, I've complied with your request for my ID. I haven't done anything wrong, and I'd appreciate it if you could tell me why you want to search my vehicle." Kyle's face hardens into a sneer. He's not used to being questioned, least of all by someone who, in his mind, shouldn't be standing up to him. To him, this is a direct challenge to his authority, and Rachel's calmness only fuels his frustration. He's been here before. He's dealt with people trying to outsmart him, make him look foolish, and he won't let that happen again. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Kyle snarls, stepping even closer, his voice lowering but dripping with venom. "I know your type. Come into a nice neighborhood like this, think you can do whatever you want. Flashing a nice car like that, huh? Probably stolen, right?" Rachel feels a knot form in her stomach, not out of fear but out of anger. This is profiling, plain and simple, and she's fully aware of it. But she also knows that reacting emotionally will only give Kyle what he wants, an excuse. She takes a deep breath, keeping her voice calm but now with a firm edge. "This car is registered in my name, officer, and I've given you no reason to believe otherwise. If you'd like to run the plates, you're more than welcome to do so." Kyle's hand twitches near his holster as he steps around her car, inspecting it as if he's about to uncover some deep criminal conspiracy. Rachel knows this game all too well, and as much as her instincts tell her to walk away or stand her ground, she opts for de-escalation. David's voice echoes in her head, "Stay calm. Control the narrative. Never let them push you into reacting." But Kyle isn't backing down. He reaches for the car door, as though it's his right to open it. Rachel moves instinctively, placing her hand on the handle before he can, blocking his access. "Officer, with all due respect," she says sharply now, "you don't have a warrant, and I don't consent to a search of my vehicle." This, for Kyle, is the final straw. His eyes flash with anger, and in a split second, he shifts from annoyed to outright hostile. His voice rises, turning from controlled aggression to outright bullying. "You're refusing to cooperate with a police officer, huh? You think you're above the law?" Kyle spits out, his voice loud and echoing down the empty street. "Let's see what happens when you don't listen to an officer's orders." Rachel stands her ground, still composed but fully aware of how dangerous this situation is becoming. She's well versed in her rights, but she also knows the statistics, how easily things can spiral out of control when authority is challenged, especially for Black women in America. She mentally debates her next move, knowing full well that calling David could make things worse before they get better. The last thing she needs is to trigger a response from Kyle that leads to violence. Just as the tension between them reaches its breaking point, a subtle vibration from Rachel's wrist brings her back to the present. Her smartwatch. The text message from David flashes on the screen, running late. 5 mins out. Everything okay? Rachel glances at the screen briefly, then back at Kyle, who's still staring her down, his hand now fully resting on the butt of his holster. The message gives her a brief sense of relief. David is close, but not close enough to stop what's about to happen. Kyle notices the glance at her watch and misinterprets it as some kind of defiance. He steps forward aggressively, closing the remaining distance between them, his face inches from hers. His voice drops into a low, threatening growl. "I told you to open the damn trunk." Rachel holds her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct is screaming at her to stay calm, to avoid giving him a reason to escalate further. But then, without warning, Kyle snaps. In one swift motion, he grabs Rachel by the arm, roughly pulling her away from the car. Her body jerks back from the force of his grip, and for a split second, she loses her balance. The situation has escalated into violence in a matter of seconds, faster than Rachel could have anticipated. The shock of it momentarily paralyzes her, but she doesn't have long to think. Kyle, filled with rage and frustration, shoves her against the side of her car, pinning her arm behind her back with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Kyle spits out, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with anger. "Let's see how you like it when we take you down to the station." Rachel's heart is racing now. Pain shoots through her arm as Kyle tightens his grip. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicks against her wrists as he locks them into place. She can barely process what's happening, but the surge of anger and disbelief in her chest is almost unbearable. For her mind flashes to David. What would he do? How would he handle this? And then she remembers he's almost here. With her free hand, Rachel subtly presses a button on her watch, activating a GPS ping that goes directly to David. It's their emergency signal, something they agreed upon for situations exactly like this. She just hopes he's close enough to respond in time. As Kyle begins dragging her toward his patrol car, Rachel fights to keep her breathing steady. She knows the situation is teetering on the edge of chaos, and all she can do is stall until David arrives, until help comes. But Kyle, high on the power of the moment, isn't paying attention to her composure. In his mind, he's already won. He's exerted control over the situation, proven his authority, and put Rachel in her place. And for him, that's all that matters. What Kyle doesn't know is that the situation is about to shift dramatically, and it won't be in his favor. Rachel's mind races as Officer Kyle Roberts grips her wrist tightly, roughly leading her toward his patrol car. The weight of the handcuffs digs into her skin, but it's not the physical pain that bothers her, it's the humiliation, the anger boiling inside her. This isn't the first time she's encountered injustice, but this is different. The sheer audacity of this man, the raw aggression in his actions, feels like a violation not only of her rights but of her very humanity. But Rachel knows she can't give in to the emotions rushing through her. Not yet. The plan she and David have devised for emergencies like this is running through her head like a mantra: stay calm, de-escalate, survive. She's already triggered the emergency GPS ping on her watch. David, her husband and seasoned CIA operative, is on his way, and she knows he's close. She just has to hold on until he arrives. Kyle, meanwhile, is completely unaware of the storm he's about to face. For him, this is just another win, another show of dominance over someone he's decided doesn't belong. His grip tightens on her arm as he shoves her toward the back seat of the patrol car, ignoring her every word, ignoring the pain he's causing. He doesn't care. In his mind, Rachel is already guilty of challenging his authority, guilty of existing in a space he deems off limits for people like her. "You think you're smart," her Kyle snarls as he opens the car door. "We'll see how smart you were down at the station." Rachel fights the urge to respond, knowing that anything she says will only escalate his aggression further. Instead, she focuses on her breathing, keeping her movements controlled, waiting for her moment. Her mind flickers to David again. He'll be here any minute, and she knows he's watching her every move through the security system embedded in her watch. They've trained for this, prepared for it, but nothing could prepare her for the sheer hatred she feels emanating from this man. As Kyle roughly pushes her into the back seat of the patrol car, Rachel notices something strange. The street, which had been eerily quiet just moments ago, seems to hum with an unusual tension. There's a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change that Kyle hasn't yet noticed. He's too focused on securing his arrest, on savoring the feeling of control. But Rachel feels it. She looks up, scanning the dark street through the window of the patrol car. At first, there's nothing. Then, in the distance, she spots a dark SUV moving slowly down the road, its headlights off, almost blending into the night. Her heart skips a beat. She knows that car. It's David. The SUV pulls up about a block away, parking silently under the shadow of a large oak tree. The doors remain closed, no lights, no movement. It's like a ghost on the street, invisible to anyone not looking for it. Rachel exhales slowly. He's here. Now, it's a matter of time. Inside the patrol car, the atmosphere grows tenser by the second. Kyle is sitting in the front, muttering under his breath as he types something into the police computer. He's agitated, Rachel can tell. He's not expecting trouble, but something about her calm demeanor, her refusal to break, is gnawing at him. It's as if he knows, deep down, that this isn't going to end the way he wants it to. Suddenly, Kyle slams his hand against the steering wheel, the sound reverberating through the quiet car. Rachel flinches, but only slightly. He turns around, his eyes full of barely contained rage. "You don't get to play the victim here," he sneers, his voice dripping with venom. "You people always think you're above the law, but not tonight. I've seen this 100 times. Try to act all innocent, like you don't know what you've done." Rachel meets his gaze, her expression steady. She doesn't need to say anything. Her silence speaks louder than words, and it infuriates him. Kyle leans closer, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're going to get out of this? You're going to beg by the time we get to the station. You'll be another name on a list, just another case no one cares about." Rachel holds his gaze, unflinching, though every muscle in her body is tense. She doesn't need to respond. She knows what's coming next, and so does Kyle. He just doesn't realize it yet. Outside, the SUV remains parked, still and silent. Rachel knows David is inside, watching everything unfold. She also knows he's waiting for the right moment, waiting to act. They've rehearsed this, how to handle situations like this, how to turn the tide without escalating to violence. David isn't just a CIA operative, he's a strategist, a master of control. He's letting Kyle dig his own grave, and Rachel, though still in handcuffs, is the key to that strategy. Kyle turns back to his computer, grumbling under his breath as he searches for something, probably trying to find any excuse to make the arrest stick. He's stalling now, unsure of his next move but too proud to admit he's in over his head. Suddenly, Kyle's police radio crackles to life. "Dispatch to Unit 4. We've got a situation at your location. Possible 10 to 96 on scene. Please advise." Rachel's pulse quickens. She knows the code 10 to 96. It's the signal David had arranged through back channels, a code that tells the dispatcher there's an undercover operation in progress. It's a warning to Kyle that he's stepped into something far bigger than a routine traffic stop. Kyle freezes, his hand hovering over the radio. For a moment, he doesn't understand what he's hearing. Then, confusion crosses his face. He reaches for the radio, his voice uncertain. Dispatch, repeat that. What's the nature of the situation?" The dispatcher's voice crackles again, calm and firm. 10 to 96 confirmed. Possible high-level operative on site. Please stand by for further instructions. Kyle's confusion turns to anger. He's not used to being kept out of the loop, and now it feels like he's losing control of the situation. He glances back at Rachel, suspicion in his eyes. Something isn't right, and for the first time tonight he feels it too. He leans into the radio again. "Dispatch, who authorized this? I'm handling the situation here. I've got it under control." There's a pause on the other end, and then a new voice cuts through the static calm, authoritative, and unmistakably in charge. This is Special Agent David Jackson, confirming 10 to 96. Officer Roberts, you are advised to stand down immediately. You've entered into a classified operation, and you are now interfering with national security. Kyle's face drains of color as the words hit him. He stares at the radio in disbelief, as if trying to process what he's just heard. Rachel watches him carefully, the smallest hint of satisfaction flickering across her face. She knew this moment was coming, but seeing the shock on Kyle's face is more satisfying than she could have imagined. Kyle fumbles for the radio, his voice trembling with confusion and barely concealed rage. What the hell is this? Who the hell do you think you are, telling me to stand down? This is my jurisdiction. David's voice comes back, colder this time, and with an edge that sends a chill down Kyle's spine. Not anymore, Officer Roberts. I suggest you comply before things get much worse for you. I'm 2 minutes away, and I've got a team ready to take control of the situation. You've made a serious mistake, and continuing this will only escalate it. Kyle's mind is racing now. He's caught off guard, and he's starting to realize just how deep in over his head he is. But his pride won't let him back down. He's never been the type to admit defeat, even when the odds are stacked against him. He turns around in his seat, glaring at Rachel, as if she's the cause of all his problems. His hand clenches into a fist, but he doesn't move. What's going on? Kyle spits out, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Who are you? Rachel meets his gaze, her calm exterior unbroken. She doesn't need to explain herself. David's already done that, and now it's just a matter of time. Before Kyle can say anything else, the low rumble of an engine cuts through the quiet night. The dark CUV pulls up beside the patrol car, its windows tinted, the engine humming like a predator ready to strike. Kyle watches in stunned silence as the door opens and David Jackson steps out, his movements precise, controlled, and deadly calm. David is not a large man, but his presence is commanding, almost unnerving. Dressed in a black suit, his expression is unreadable, his eyes locked on Kyle. In his hand, he holds a small device, and as he approaches the patrol car, he presses a button. Rachel hears the unmistakable click of her handcuffs releasing, the metal cuffs dropping to the floor of the car with a dull thud. Kyle's face pales as he watches this unfold. For the first time, true fear flickers in his eyes. This isn't a routine stop gone wrong anymore, this is something far more dangerous. David leans down, peering into the car window where Kyle sits frozen in his seat. His voice is low, barely above a whisper, but it carries the weight of someone who's used to being in control. You have no idea what you've just done, David says, his eyes never leaving Kyle's. And trust me, you're going to regret every second of it. Kyle swallows hard, his hand still resting on his holster, but he doesn't dare draw it. He knows now that this is far beyond his control. Rachel steps out of the patrol car, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs, but her expression remains calm, unshaken. She walks over to David, standing by his side, as Kyle watches, powerless to stop them. David gives Rachel a brief nod, then turns his attention back to Kyle. His voice is ice cold as he speaks. Get out of the car, Officer Roberts. We're going to have a little talk. Kyle hesitates, his mind racing with possibilities, but there's no way out now. He slowly reaches for the door handle, his hands trembling, knowing that whatever happens next will change his life forever. As Kyle slowly steps out of the patrol car, he can feel the walls closing in around him. Every instinct tells him to run, to fight back, to do something, but he's frozen. David Jackson stands there, watching him with a cold, calculating gaze that cuts deeper than anything Kyle has ever experienced. The power dynamic has completely shifted, and for the first time in his career, Kyle isn't the one in control. He's never encountered someone like David before, someone who exudes authority without needing to raise their voice or even make a move. This isn't the kind of power that comes with a badge or a gun. This is something far more dangerous. Rachel stands next to David now, her calm composure unbroken, but there's an undeniable intensity in her eyes. Despite the rough treatment she's endured, there's no sign of weakness in her. If anything, her silence makes her presence even more imposing. Kyle feels a flash of confusion mixed with fear. Who are these people? The night air is thick with tension as the three of them stand in the street, the quiet suburban neighborhood now feeling like the scene of an impending storm. The streetlights cast long shadows, flickering slightly in the distance, as if reflecting the uncertainty of the moment. Kyle is used to being the one who dictates how things go in situations like this. He's the cop, he's the authority, but none of that matters now. David finally breaks the silence, his voice as cold and precise as his movements. "You've made a critical mistake, Officer Roberts," he says, taking a step closer. "One that's going to cost you more than you could ever imagine." Kyle's heart races, and his mind struggles to make sense of the situation. Everything is spiraling out of control. He thought this was a simple stop, a routine moment to flex his power, but now it's become something else entirely. He's never been in a position where someone else had such absolute control over the outcome, especially not someone like David, someone who doesn't seem afraid of anything. "I don't know what the hell you think you're doing," Kyle says, trying to regain some sense of authority, though his voice betrays the fear creeping in. "But this is my jurisdiction. You don't get to tell me what to do." David's lips curl into a small, almost imperceptible smirk, as though Kyle's words are nothing more than a minor inconvenience, an irritation to be brushed aside. "Your jurisdiction," David repeats, his tone mocking, but still eerily calm. "Do you even realize who you're talking to? This isn't about jurisdiction anymore. You've crossed into territory you should have never touched, and now you're going to pay for it." Kyle's mouth goes dry. He's never dealt with someone like this before. David's demeanor isn't just authoritative, it's deadly. There's something in his eyes that makes it clear he's not bluffing, and that scares Kyle more than he's willing to admit. He tries to assert himself again, but his confidence is crumbling with every second. "What are you, some kind of government agent?" Kyle blurts out, though he already knows the answer. "CIA? FBI? What's your angle here?" David doesn't answer right away. He takes another step closer, his eyes never leaving Kyle's. The silence is suffocating, and every second that passes only intensifies the pressure. Kyle feels like he's standing on the edge of a cliff, and David is the one deciding whether he falls or not. "I'm the one you should have never crossed," David says finally, his voice so quiet and controlled that it sends a shiver down Kyle's spine. "You don't even realize how badly you've miscalculated." Kyle's instinct to resist is strong, but he knows, deep down, that resisting won't save him now. He's no longer the predator here, he's the prey. His hand hovers near his holster, as if that's his last line of defense, but even that feels meaningless in the face of whatever David has planned. Rachel watches this exchange in silence, but her presence is palpable. Kyle glances at her, hoping to see some sign of weakness, some indication that he can still control this situation, but there's nothing. She stands tall, her eyes locked on his, showing no fear, no anger, just quiet, unshakable resolve. He realizes now that this was never about her compliance. She's been playing the long game, waiting for David to arrive, waiting for this moment to unfold exactly as it has. Just then, another figure emerges from the dark SUV parked down the street. It's one of David's men, a tall, imposing figure dressed in black tactical gear, his face obscured by the shadows. He moves silently, his steps measured, purposeful. He's not carrying a weapon, at least not visibly, but his presence is enough to send another wave of fear through Kyle. This is no ordinary backup. David doesn't even acknowledge the man's presence. He doesn't need to. The message is clear: Kyle is outnumbered, outmatched, and out of time. Here's what's going to happen, David says, taking control of the situation once again. You're going to turn around, put your hands on the hood of your car, and wait quietly while we decide what to do with you. If you resist, if you even think about reaching for that gun, it's over. Kyle's breath catches in his throat. He's never been spoken to like this before, not by anyone. The power dynamic has shifted so drastically that he can barely process it. His mind races, searching for a way out, but there's nothing. He's cornered. For a brief moment, he considers reaching for his weapon, but something in David's eyes stops him cold. There's no doubt in those eyes, only certainty. Certainty that if Kyle makes the wrong move, it will be the last move he ever makes. Reluctantly, Kyle turns around, his hands shaking slightly as he places them on the hood of his patrol car. His heart pounds in his chest and sweat beads on his forehead. He can feel the weight of David's gaze on his back, unrelenting and unforgiving. Behind him, Rachel steps forward, her calm voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You didn't expect this, did you, Officer Roberts?" she says, her tone soft but edged with steel. "You thought this would be easy, that you could just throw your weight around and no one would push back. But you were wrong." Kyle doesn't respond. He can't. His mind is too consumed with fear and confusion. How did this go so wrong, so fast? David walks around to face Kyle, his eyes cold and calculating. He leans in slightly, his voice low enough that only Kyle can hear. "You've crossed a line tonight," David says, his voice deadly serious. "A line you can never come back from. You don't know it yet, but your life as you know it is over." Kyle swallows hard, his throat dry. He wants to protest, to fight back, but the words die in his throat. He knows that David isn't bluffing. He's seen men like David before, men who don't make empty threats, and that's what terrifies him the most. David steps back, giving Kyle a moment to breathe, but the tension doesn't ease. If anything, it gets worse. The silence is deafening, the weight of what's happening pressing down on Kyle with crushing force. Just then, the figure from the SUV steps forward. He moves with purpose, his steps silent and calculated. Without saying a word, he produces a small tablet from his jacket pocket and hands it to David. David takes it without looking, his eyes still locked on Kyle. David taps a few buttons on the tablet, and the screen lights up. Kyle watches in stunned silence as a series of files and documents flash across the screen, files that he recognizes immediately. They're his personnel records, his disciplinary reports, his complaints of misconduct. Everything he thought had been buried, forgotten, is now being displayed right in front of him. "How? How did you get those?" Kyle stammers, his voice shaking with disbelief. David doesn't answer right away. He scrolls through the files, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he looks up at Kyle, his eyes cold as ice. "You really thought you could hide this?" David asks, his voice dripping with contempt. "You thought no one would find out what kind of man you really are?" Kyle feels a chill run down his spine. He's heard stories, whispers about people like David, people with the power to ruin lives with a single phone call. But he never thought it would happen to him. He thought he was untouchable. Now, He realizes just how wrong he was. David steps closer, holding the tablet up so that Kyle can see the screen clearly. Every complaint, every report, every time you abused your power, it's all here. And now it's in my hands. Kyle's knees go weak. His entire career, everything he's worked for, is unraveling before his eyes. He can't believe it. He can't believe that his life is being destroyed so quickly, so completely. Please, Kyle whispers, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean. I didn't know. David cuts him off, his voice sharp and unyielding. It's too late for that. You made your choices, Officer Roberts. Now, you're going to live with the consequences. Rachel steps forward, her eyes locked on Kyle. There's no anger in her expression, no hatred, just quiet, unshakable resolve. You should have listened, she says softly. You should have known better. The weight of her words crushes Kyle. He hangs his head, defeated, as the reality of his situation sinks in. There's no way out now, no way to undo what's been done. David hands the tablet back to his man, who disappears into the shadows once again. He takes one last look at Kyle, then turns to Rachel, his expression softening for the first time that night. It's over, he says quietly. Let's go home. Rachel nods, relief washing over her, though the weight of what just happened still lingers. Together, they walk toward the SUV, leaving Kyle standing alone by his patrol car, his life in ruins. As they drive away, the silence between them speaks volumes. They've won, but the battle isn't over. There will be consequences, there always are. But for now, they've reclaimed their power. For now, they've won. As the dark SUV pulls away from the scene, leaving Officer Kyle Roberts standing alone under the dim streetlights, the reality of what just happened begins to crash down on him like a tidal wave. His mind races, trying to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. But the more he tries to think, the more trapped he feels. David Jackson, the man who just dismantled his life in a matter of minutes, is not someone he can forget or fight against. But Kyle, for all his fear and confusion, is still a man who spent his entire career asserting power over others. Even now, his pride won't let him fully accept defeat. There's a voice inside him, a dangerous, reckless voice that refuses to back down. He's already lost control of the situation, but in his mind, there has to be something he can do to regain it. There has to be a way to get out of this. He stumbles back toward his patrol car, the hood still warm from where he'd pressed his hands just moments before. His hands shake as he reaches for the door, pulling it open and sliding into the driver's seat. He grabs the radio, his fingers trembling as he brings it to his lips. This is Officer Roberts. Requesting immediate backup at my location, he says, his voice shaky but still trying to sound authoritative. I've encountered a hostile situation. Need assistance. For a moment, there's nothing but static on the other end. Then, the dispatcher's voice crackles through the speaker, calm and professional. Officer Roberts, please confirm the nature of the situation. We've received no reports of disturbance in your area. Kyle hesitates, his mind scrambling for an answer. How does he explain what just happened? That he's been completely overpowered by a man with connections far beyond his reach. That his attempt to control the situation has led to a complete collapse of his authority. Dispatch, this is Roberts. I'm dealing with an undercover agent. Possible national security issue. I need backup now. There's a long pause on the other end, and Kyle's heart pounds in his chest as he waits for a response. He's not even sure if what he's saying makes sense anymore. He's just trying to grasp at any lifeline he can find. But instead of the backup he's expecting, The dispatcher's voice comes back, more cautious this time. Officer Roberts, you are advised to stand down. We've been instructed that the situation is being handled by federal authorities. No further action is required from local law enforcement. Kyle's stomach drops. Federal authorities. David's words echo in his mind. You've crossed into territory you should have never touched. This is far bigger than he realized, and now even the dispatcher is telling him to stand down. But Kyle's pride, his anger, his frustration, they won't let him quit. He can't stand the idea of just walking away, of accepting defeat at the hands of David Jackson, not after everything that's just happened. Slamming the radio down, Kyle's hands grip the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His thoughts are chaotic, but one thing is clear in his mind: he can't let this go. He won't. If he gives up now, his career, his life, it's all over. But if he fights back, maybe, just maybe, he can salvage something. A reckless idea begins to form in his mind, and though he knows it's dangerous, he's too far gone to care. He turns the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and pulls out onto the street. He knows where the SUV is headed. They're not far, he can catch up. Kyle floors the gas pedal, his eyes scanning the road ahead. His thoughts are racing almost as fast as the car, his mind consumed with a single, desperate goal: regain control. Prove he's not the weak, powerless man David made him out to be. Meanwhile, inside the dark SUV, Rachel sits in silence beside David as they drive through the quiet suburban streets. The adrenaline from the confrontation is still coursing through her veins, but her mind is finally beginning to settle. The plan worked. David's calm, controlled approach to the situation diffused it without violence. Still, there's an emotional weight hanging over her, the realization of just how close she came to being another victim of unchecked power. David, too, is quiet. His hands grip the steering wheel with a kind of focus that Rachel knows all too well. He's not thinking about what just happened, he's already planning the next move. That's how he works. Always 3 steps ahead. You okay? David finally asks, his voice breaking the silence but still low, as if not wanting to disturb the delicate calm that settled between them. Rachel nods, though she's not entirely sure how to answer. Physically, she's fine. Mentally, though, she's still processing everything that transpired. I'm fine, she says, her voice steady but soft. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but it's the first time it's gone this far. David glances at her briefly, his expression unreadable but filled with concern. He knows Rachel is stronger than most, but that doesn't mean he doesn't worry. He's seen too many situations like this spiral out of control, and the thought of losing her to something so senseless gnaws at him in ways he doesn't often show. I know, he says quietly, but we handled it. He won't bother you again. Rachel looks out the window, her mind wandering back to Kyle. She doesn't doubt David's ability to control the situation, but she also knows how men like Kyle think. They don't just give up. They're driven by ego, by a desperate need to reclaim the power they feel slipping away. She can't help but wonder if this is really over. As if reading her thoughts, David speaks again, this time with more steel in his voice. If he tries anything else, we'll be ready. I promise you that. Rachel nods, but before she can respond, a sudden flash of headlights fills the rearview mirror. The SUV jolts slightly as another car barrels up behind them at high speed, its headlights glaring like a pair of angry eyes. David's jaw tightens. He glances in the mirror, instantly recognizing the vehicle. It's him, David says, his voice now cold and sharp. Kyle. Rachel's heart skips a beat. She turns to look out the back window, seeing the patrol car speeding toward them, its sirens off, but the intent unmistakable. He's coming for them, and he's not backing down. "What's he doing?" Rachel asks, though she already knows the answer. David doesn't respond. His mind is already calculating their next move, assessing the situation with the precision of a man trained to handle high-stakes confrontations. He floors the gas pedal, the SUV surging forward as they try to put distance between themselves and Kyle. But Kyle is relentless. His patrol car closes the gap quickly, and soon he's right behind them, his headlights flashing, the engine roaring as he pushes the vehicle to its limits. He's not following protocol, he's out for revenge, and it's clear that reason has long since left him. Rachel grips the seat, her pulse quickening as the chase intensifies. The streets around them are dark, empty, but the danger is palpable. This isn't a routine traffic stop anymore, this is personal. Kyle has crossed a line, and now they're both in uncharted territory. David swerves the SUV around a corner, the tires screeching against the pavement. He's trying to lose Kyle in the narrow, winding streets of the neighborhood, but Kyle is relentless, refusing to let up. The patrol car stays right on their tail, the gap between them closing with every second. Rachel's mind races, trying to think of a way to stop this before it goes too far. But before she can speak, the patrol car rams into the back of the SUV, sending a violent jolt through the vehicle. Rachel is thrown forward, her seatbelt locking her in place, but the impact leaves her breathless. David curses under his breath, gripping the steering wheel as he tries to regain control. But Kyle isn't stopping. He rams the SUV again, harder this time, pushing them closer to the edge of the road. "This guy is out of his mind," David mutters, his voice tight with frustration. He glances at Rachel, his expression hardening. "Get ready. This isn't going to end well." Rachel barely has time to react before Kyle rams them again, this time with enough force to send the SUV skidding off the road. The tires hit the gravel, and the vehicle lurches to the side, crashing through a row of bushes before coming to a sudden, violent stop against a concrete barrier. The air is thick with the sound of screeching tires and the crunch of metal as the SUV comes to a halt. Rachel's head spins, the force of the crash disorienting her for a moment, but she's conscious. David's voice cuts through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Rachel, you okay?" She nods, trying to steady her breathing. "Yeah, I'm fine." David looks back at the patrol car, which has also come to a stop a few yards behind them. The headlights are still glaring, and Kyle is already stepping out of the vehicle, his hand on his holster, his face twisted in rage. "This ends now," David says, his voice low but filled with a quiet fury. He unclips his seatbelt and reaches for something beneath his seat, a small, sleek handgun. Rachel watches as he checks the weapon with the practiced precision of a man who's done this too many times before. "David, wait," Rachel begins, but he cuts her off with a look. There's no talking him down, Rachel. He's made his choice. Outside, Kyle is already approaching, his gun drawn, his steps heavy with intent. He's beyond reason now, his mind consumed with a need for revenge, for power. He raises the gun, aiming it directly at the SUV. David pushes open the door, stepping out into the night, his gun at his side but ready. His movements are slow, deliberate, calculated. He knows exactly what he's doing. This isn't the first time he's faced down a man like Kyle. Rachel watches, her heart pounding in her chest. She knows David can handle himself, but the fear that this could be the moment everything goes wrong is almost overwhelming. Kyle stops a few feet away, his gun still aimed at David. His face is twisted with rage, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. You think you can just walk away from this? Kyle spits, his eyes wild. You think you're untouchable? I'm not done with you. David doesn't flinch. He stands perfectly still, his eyes locked on Kyle's, unblinking, unafraid. You're done, Kyle David says, his voice calm, controlled. You lost the moment you decided to come after us. Kyle's grip on the gun tightens, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a brief, terrifying moment, Rachel thinks he's going to pull it. But then, something changes. There's a flicker of doubt in Kyle's eyes, a hesitation that wasn't there before. David sees it too. He takes a step closer, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to do this, Kyle. It's over. For a moment, it seems like Kyle is going to listen. His hand wavers, the gun lowering slightly. But then, with a sudden burst of rage, he raises it again, his face contorted in fury. David moves faster than Rachel can comprehend. In a single, fluid motion, he raises his own gun and fires a single shot. The sound echoes through the night, sharp and final. Kyle drops to the ground, his gun falling from his hand as he crumples to the pavement. He's not dead, but he's been stopped, his arm bleeding from a well-placed shot that disarmed him without ending his life. Rachel exhales, her body trembling from the adrenaline. It's over. Finally, it's over. David walks over to Kyle, his gun still in hand, though he's no longer aiming it. He kneels down beside the wounded officer, his voice calm but firm. You made the wrong choice, Kyle, and now you're going to pay for it. Kyle looks up at him, his face pale and twisted with pain. There's no defiance left in him, no anger, only fear and regret. David stands, holstering his gun as the sound of sirens begins to fill the air. Backup has arrived, but it's too late. The situation is already over. Rachel steps out of the SUV, her legs unsteady but her mind clear. She walks over to David, standing beside him as they watch the approaching lights of the police cars. It's over, she says softly, though the words feel heavy in her mouth. David nods, his expression unreadable. For now. But they both know the truth. This is just the beginning of the fallout. As the sirens grow louder and the flashing blue and red lights approach, David and Rachel stand side by side in the dim glow of the streetlights. The tension in the air is palpable, and despite the silence between them, they both understand the gravity of what has just transpired. The fallout from Kyle Roberts' reckless actions is inevitable, but they've done what they had to do. Kyle lies on the ground, clutching his bleeding arm, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. The man who once commanded fear and control now looks broken, a shell of the power-hungry officer he was just moments ago. His gun lies a few feet away, abandoned on the pavement, a stark reminder of how quickly things escalated and how fast he fell from power. David keeps his eyes on Kyle as the first police car screeches to a halt nearby. Two uniformed officers jump out, guns drawn, though the sight of their wounded colleague sprawled on the ground immediately gives them pause. They exchange quick glances, unsure of how to proceed. It's clear they've been trained to react to emergencies, but not one like this one where a high-ranking CIA operative and his wife are involved. Hands where we can see them, one of the officers shouts, though his voice falters slightly, betraying his uncertainty. David calmly raises his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. He knows the drill. He's been on both sides of this kind of situation before. He knows how to make it clear that he's not a threat, even though everyone present knows he's the one in control. Rachel follows suit, her hands rising in the air, though her face remains stoic. She's not afraid, not anymore. The adrenaline still courses through her veins, but she feels a deep, steady calm knowing that the danger is behind them. Kyle Roberts has been neutralized, and now it's just a matter of dealing with the aftermath. Step away from him, the second officer commands, his gun still trained on David, though the hesitation in his voice is even more obvious now. He doesn't know what to make of this situation, and it's clear that he's waiting for more instructions from someone higher up. David steps back from Kyle, keeping his hands up, his expression unwavering. He's already mentally shifted gears, thinking ahead, preparing for the questions that are about to come, the explanations he'll have to give. But he's not concerned. Everything has been calculated, controlled. They've won. Behind them, more police cars arrive, and soon the quiet street is flooded with officers, lights and radios crackling with activity. One of the officers kneels beside Kyle, inspecting his wound, while another speaks rapidly into his radio, calling for an ambulance. Officer down. "We need medical assistance immediately," the officer says, though his eyes flick to David and Rachel, trying to assess the situation. Finally, a senior officer arrives, a lieutenant, by the looks of his uniform. His face is stern, his posture rigid as he takes in the scene. He's clearly been briefed to some extent, but the confusion and tension are still evident in his eyes as he approaches David. "I'm Lieutenant Harrison," he says, his voice steady but cautious. "We need to understand what happened here." David lowers his hands, his expression still calm, controlled. He nods toward Kyle, who's being attended to by the medics now arriving at the scene. "He drew his weapon on us," David says simply. "I disarmed him. Non-lethal shot. He's going to be fine." Lieutenant Harrison glances at Kyle, then back at David, his brow furrowed. He's clearly wrestling with the weight of what's happening. He knows David isn't an ordinary civilian, and that complicates things. But there's protocol to follow. "We'll need statements from both of you," Harrison says, gesturing to Rachel as well. "This is a serious incident. The department will need to investigate." David nods. "Of course, we'll cooperate fully." There's a pause. A beat of silence where it feels like everyone on the street is holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Then, as if on cue, David reaches into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulls out his CIA credentials. He hands them to the lieutenant, who takes them with a slight hesitation, his eyes widening as he reads the badge. "I'm fully authorized to handle this situation," David says, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm sure your department has already been briefed. This goes beyond local jurisdiction." Lieutenant Harrison blinks, clearly caught off guard. He glances down at the badge, then back at David. The weight of the situation is sinking in now, and it's clear that this isn't something that can be resolved with a simple police report. I understand," Harrison says slowly. "But we'll still need to follow procedure. Officer Roberts." "Officer Roberts attacked my wife," David interrupts, his tone sharp but controlled. "He's the one who escalated the situation. You'll find everything you need in the report I'll submit." Harrison swallows hard, nodding, though it's clear he's struggling to keep up with the gravity of what's happening. The other officers nearby have holstered their weapons, and the medics continue to tend to Kyle, who groans in pain but is otherwise silent, his rage and defiance gone. Rachel stands quietly beside David, her eyes never leaving the scene. She knows this isn't over, not completely. There will be investigations, questions, inquiries, but she also knows that they've done everything right. There's no question in her mind about who was in the wrong. "I'll make sure my people coordinate with yours," David says, taking back his badge from Harrison. But for now, I'd appreciate it if you could see to it that we're taken care of. My wife has been through enough for one night." Lieutenant Harrison nods, his expression serious. "I understand. We'll make sure everything is handled properly." David turns to Rachel, his expression softening slightly. "You ready?" Rachel takes a deep breath, nodding. "Let's go." Together, they walk toward the SUV, leaving the scene behind them as the police and medics handle the aftermath. The tension in the air slowly begins to dissipate, replaced by the distant hum of radios and the chatter of officers trying to make sense of what just unfolded. As they drive away, the quiet of the night returns, the flashing lights and chaos fading in the distance. Rachel leans back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, the exhaustion finally catching up with her. It's over. The threat is gone. But even as the adrenaline fades, she knows that this night will leave its mark. They've won, but the cost of victory is never light. David glances over at her, his expression unreadable as always, but there's a quiet understanding between them. They did what needed to be done. Kyle Roberts is no longer a threat, but the world is full of men like him. And this, they both know, won't be the last time they face such a fight. Days have passed since the confrontation with Officer Kyle Roberts, but the tension still lingers in the air. Rachel and David Jackson have resumed their daily lives, but the weight of what happened that night has left a permanent mark on both of them. The world hasn't returned to normal. It never really does after something like that. Rachel sits in the sunlit kitchen of their home, sipping her morning coffee, her thoughts drifting back to the events that unfolded. She's been through stressful situations before, even dangerous ones, but there's something about this incident that feels different. Maybe it's because it was so personal an attack, not just on her identity, but on her safety and her dignity as a black woman. The media has stayed relatively quiet on the matter. David's connections ensured that the story didn't blow up in the way it could have, keeping the focus on the investigation rather than creating a public spectacle. It was a tactical move, protecting them from unnecessary attention, but Rachel can't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, she's glad their private lives aren't being picked apart in the news. On the other hand, she knows that stories like hers happen every day, and many of them don't end as well. David walks into the kitchen, his movements as quiet and calculated as ever. He's always been the calm one, the steady hand that guides her through the chaos of their intertwined lives. But even he can't completely shake the weight of what happened. As he pours himself a cup of coffee, Rachel looks at him, her voice soft but filled with unspoken thoughts. "Do you think it's really over?" she asks, knowing that David is always thinking several steps ahead. David sits down across from her, his eyes focused on her as he considers her question. "It's over for Roberts," he says, his voice measured. "But we both know he's not the only one." Rachel nods, understanding. Roberts was just one man, one part of a much larger problem that stretches far beyond him. They both know that his actions were a symptom of something bigger, systemic issues that don't go away just because one person is taken out of the equation. The investigation is going through the usual channels, David continues. Internal affairs, legal reviews. But there's no question Roberts' career is finished. He's facing charges for misconduct, unlawful use of force, and a host of other things. He won't be a problem anymore. Rachel takes a deep breath, relieved but still not fully at ease. And what about us? Are we safe? David's gaze softens as he looks at her. He reaches across the table, taking her hand in his. "We're safe," he says quietly. "I've made sure of that. But you know as well as I do, it's never just about one moment. We have to stay vigilant." She squeezes his hand, thankful for his unwavering support. But there's a part of her that feels the weight of that reality. They can never fully let their guard down, not in a world where people like Roberts exist, where prejudice and abuse of power can surface at any time, in any place. The sound of a phone vibrating on the kitchen counter breaks the silence. David reaches for it, glancing at the screen. His expression hardens slightly, though not with surprise, more with quiet resignation. "It's from the bureau," he says, standing up. "I need to take this." Rachel watches as he steps out of the room, his voice low as he speaks into the phone. She knows what this means: more fallout from the investigation, more maneuvering behind the scenes to make sure everything is handled properly. David will protect her, just as he always has, but she knows that his work in the shadows doesn't end here. It never does. When David returns, his expression is as calm as ever, but there's a new tension in his eyes. "It's all under control," he says, sitting back down. "Roberts is being formally charged today. The department is distancing itself from him, of course, but it's clear he's not coming back from this." Rachel nods, feeling a sense of closure, but also a lingering sense of injustice. And what about the others? The ones who let him get away with it for so long? David looks at her, his eyes hardening slightly. "That's the real fight, isn't it?" Rachel lets the words sink in. It's always been about more than just one man, more than just one incident. The system that allowed Roberts to act with impunity for so long is still there, and while they've won this battle, the war is far from over. But for now, they've secured a small victory. Roberts won't harm anyone else. That, at least, is something to hold on to. David stands, walking over to Rachel and pulling her into a quiet embrace. She leans into him, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his presence ease the tension that's been building inside her for days. They don't need to say anything. The connection between them is enough. "Whatever happens next," David says softly, "we'll face it together." Rachel nods against his chest, feeling a sense of peace settle over her, even if only for a moment. She knows that the fight isn't over, but she also knows that she's not alone in it. With David by her side, they'll continue to push back against the forces that seek to harm them. They'll continue to stand strong. As the morning light filters through the window, illuminating their quiet moment of unity, Rachel allows herself to hope that change, though slow and difficult, is possible. Hope that their efforts will make a difference, no matter how small. And with that hope, they move forward.